I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from the front lines, discuss Ukraine's ongoing bid for NATO membership, and we interview Ukrainian writer and soldier, Oleksandr Mykhed.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelenska the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 21st of June, 2 years and 120 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and our guest is Ukrainian writer Oleksandr Mykhed. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, and hello to you wherever you are. Let's start inside Russia for a change. Ukraine's military this morning says it struck 4 oil refineries and military objects in Russia last night. Targets included radar stations, electronic intelligence centres and drone storage facilities. This attack was said to have taken place in the early hours of this morning. The Russian Defence Ministry said it had repelled a mass drone attack of 114 drones over Crimea, the Black Sea and the Krasnodar region in southern Russia. They did, however, say one person was killed, so it can't have been totally. They said Regional Governor Veniamin Kondratyev on Telegram said that in Krasnodar, an employee of a heating station was killed when a drone hit the facility. Several administrative buildings at an oil refinery were also damaged in the Seversky district, he said. That's about 200 kilometres due east of the Kerch Bridge. Drones are also thought to have targeted a military airfield in Yeysk during the attack in that region. So this is right in the top northeast corner of the Sea of Azov. A defence source speaking to the Kyiv Independent said that a joint attack by the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, and the Navy's missile forces had targeted Russia's 167th Training Centre at the Yeysk military airfield. We're told that's where Shahid drones are being stored. The source said that there were several blasts and secondary explosions recorded at the base. Then inside Ukraine, and Ukraine is said to be dispatching reinforcements to Chasiv Yar. In a statement last night, the 24th Mech Brigade said it was moving units redeployed to strengthen the defence of Chasiv Yar sector. The statement said, the situation in and around the town is extremely difficult. The enemy is constantly organising massive frontal assaults and also trying to bypass the settlement from the north and south. Now, the unit being redeployed, we are told, is coming from the town of Toretsk. Now, that's about 20 k's due south of Chasiv Yar, but interestingly, it's on the southern side of that road, the T0504, that runs southwest-northeast across the area. That was on the original front line after the invasion in 2014, the line that's not moved very much in the war. You'll remember Roland came on yesterday talking about that. He said he's been there a few times, and he said that bit of the front hasn't moved much at all since February 2022. He was surprised that it now seemed to be a feature. We were assessing maybe that's become a bit of an effort because Russia want to cut that road, which is said to be the main logistics route into the Chasiv Yar area. Well, perhaps the situation isn't quite as fluid as we thought it was. Maybe Toretsk isn't under such a threat if troops are able to be taken away from there for the defence of Chasiv Yar. I mean, this all comes under the big banner of we don't really know, and I'm afraid that is the fog of war in action. You get little bits of information, you can extrapolate and squeeze it as far as it'll go, but it is very, very difficult to try and get any real ground truth because of that's the nature of war. But we pass on to you what we see with hopefully sensible analysis, and we will try and make sense of it. Okay, next one. There are reports Russian forces lost a Kamov Ka-29 Helix B naval helicopter while out hunting Ukrainian maritime drones over the Black Sea this morning. There are reports that was shot down by friendly fire, as in Russian fire bringing down its own aircraft. The open source intelligence site Ozint Technical says that Russian social media outfit Fighter Bomber, this group is said to be pretty close to the Russian Air Force in terms of what they report on and assess. They seem quite close to it. So Ozint Technical citing fighter bomber, they are blaming friendly fire due to a malfunctioning or an absent IFF. IFF is identification friend or foe. It's a little radio signal or other communication from aircraft generally, although it can be anything, quite frankly. But IFF is most usually connected to or talked of in the context of aircraft. It's the signal saying to your friendly forces, I'm me, don't shoot at me. Now, there are reports that Ukraine is combining aerial and maritime drones, which could be one of the reasons Russia is increasingly at risk of shooting down its own helicopters. H. Sutton, who runs the Covert Shores website, well worth a look, he did a piece last month on the new Ukrainian uncrewed surface vessel, a drone, called the Magura. Said it's armed with an AA-11 R-73 Archer surface-to-air missile. They're calling this another Franken-SAM improvised air defence system. So H. Sutton was saying this is the first time anything like anti-aircraft missiles mounted on sea drones had been observed. And this incident that happened early last month, the drone was engaged by a Russian helicopter and eventually sunk. But the point here is that if this is a new tactic by Ukraine, if they put... So maritime drones go out, and they're canoe size, they're 10 feet-ish. There's different variants, but you're looking at that kind of size vessel with a great big bomb on board that goes and spanks into the side of a Russian ship, and hopefully the ship then goes down. Russia's been countering that threat by putting up helicopters to shoot at them. And there have been numerous examples of those drones being knocked out, being destroyed by fire from Russian helicopters. We saw there's some amazing footage about a year ago, actually, I think it was, of you saw we think it was a Kamov or it might have been a HIP that was shooting at a drone. You can see the rounds hitting the water near the drone as it zips along and then piles into a Russian ship. So that seems to be Russia's tactic to deal with maritime drones. But their tactic to deal with aerial drones is to fire air defence, or if it's close enough to the ship or shore, to fire small arms. So individual service personnel with their personal weapon just firing lead in the air to knock these things down. Combine the two, and it ain't great for Russian helicopters. So now if you've got this thing, a Ukrainian maritime drone that's got a missile on it that can go and do some damage either to, it's going to go bang wherever it lands, aircraft, ships, or on land. If Russia put up a helicopter to try and bring that down, but at the same time Ukraine is launching aerial drone waves, you can see why there's suddenly a lot of stuff being fired through the air. Maybe the Russian IFF system, remember the identification friend or foe, is not working properly, and a Russian missile fired at an airborne drone hits the helicopter by accident. So a lot of ifs, buts and maybes, but that might be what's happening there. One swallow doesn't make a summer holiday, excuse me. But maybe this is something that we're going to see more of. We will keep our eye on that. Okay, next one. President Zelenska has set out steps to protect the country's energy supply in his nightly address to the nation last night. The plan includes installing solar power in homes, we are told, rapidly building protection for energy infrastructure and creating new decentralised energy capacities. This obviously comes in the context of Russia's recently intensified campaign against energy infrastructure. And as a reminder, Kyiv said in March, they said that half of its energy generating capacity had been knocked out, and there are now rolling blackouts across the country. A couple more from me. There's been more shuffling in Russia's top ranks. So Russian authorities have formally dismissed Timur Ivanov, the deputy defense minister jailed on bribery charges. He's also accused by Kremlin critics of living a lavish lifestyle, God forbid. This is reported in the Russian media yesterday. So 48-year-old Mr. Ivanov, one of several senior military officers arrested on corruption charges in recent months. He was a close associate of Sergei Shoigu, defense minister who lost his job last month. Ivanov was arrested in April and charged with taking, what we're told was an especially large bribe. So, quite what that means in the context of Russia is anyone's guess, but, pretty big. But yesterday, so we talked about him before and his arrest, but yesterday he was dismissed from his post and a court ordered that his pre-trial detention should be extended for 3 more months. If convicted, he faces up to 15 years in prison. Now, there's a lot of commentary going about what's happening here. There are reports that Putin is trying to pin the blame for Russia's poor performance in the war on the defense ministry. We are told that the FSB, the internal Russia's security service, were keen to get stuck into Russia's MOD, but had been prevented by Shoigu. Now he's gone, they are all over it, and they are going through the place, and we should expect more of that. And then just lastly from me, a bit of assessment from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, a US-based think tank. They're saying that Russian forces have used their new glide bomb, the FAB 3000 M54, new glide bomb, with a module called a Unified Planning and Correction Module, UMPC. You'll hear that phrase around and about. But basically, they used this thing for the first time to hit Ukrainian positions in Lipsky, up in that whatever's happening north of Kharkiv, and there's not an awful lot happening up there, on June the 20th, noting that the bomb caused substantial destruction even though it landed 10 metres away from its target. Now, intended target, assessed target. First time it's been used. There was geolocated footage published by the ISW yesterday saying that Ukraine is making advances at pushing back the Vovchansk incursion. Lipsky is on the sort of western side of that thing up in Kharkiv Oblast. But maybe in relation to their lines going back, Russia are now using this new bomb. You remember, so Sergei Shoigu first announced this variant, the M54 variant of the FAB 3000, back in March. These are each one over about 3,000 kilograms, so big, heavy old things, converted into glide bombs. They're dumb bombs. The 3000 Ks is a dumb bomb. I think just very basic Second World War type, a dumb bomb. But with this UMPC modification, the Unified Planning and Correction Module, it can glide. So there is some element of targeting available to it. Now, Russian sources had previously praised the production of this new weapon, but thought that the weight and size of it would make it very difficult for most Russian tactical aircraft to deploy. The suggestion they've figured out how to get these things on the rails of Russian fighters or fighter bombers is a significant development. And the ISW say that this represents a new Russian capability with a high potential for destruction if Moscow's forces are able to continue to use such weapons uninhibited. But of course, the jets launching them have to fly from somewhere, which, if the airfields are in Russia, have generally been outside the range of Western donated military equipment up to now. That may be about to change. Hold that thought for a moment.
Thank you, Dom. Just a quick message from us before we move on. On Saturday the 29th of June, Ukraine the Latest will be doing a live show at the Stephen Joseph Theatre in Scarborough in the northeast of England. The show will be in the early evening, and myself, Dom, Francis and Roland Oliphant will be discussing the military lessons for the West from 2 years of the full-scale invasion. For tickets, just go to the Scarborough Fair website or follow the link in the show notes. We really look forward to seeing you there.
And I will pass over to the fashionable one.
Francis, does he mean you? Should we go to you now?
Well, thank you very much, David. I'm not the one wearing a pink shirt, Dom, you are. So I think today you win the sartorial contest. But it's obviously been a big week politically, especially in the Russian context, but plenty today to discuss from the Western Ukraine perspective. First, though, staying on weapons, as Dom just alluded to, a fascinating and revealing snippet from US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who is reported in Politico as saying in a press conference that Washington has told Ukraine it can now use American-supplied weapons to hit any Russian forces attacking from across the border, not just those in the region near Kharkiv, according to US officials. That subtle shift in messaging, which officials insist is not a change in policy, comes just weeks, of course, after the US quietly gave Kyiv the green light to strike inside Russia in a response to the cross-border assaults on the city of Kharkiv. At the same time, US officials stressed that the policy was limited to that region, among other restrictions. Evidence, though, now that things have begun to change. American weapons have struck Russia at least once, destroying targets in the city of Belgorod, and managed to hold back, of course, the Russian assault. Hence why we've been talking about the past couple of weeks whether the most precarious moment for Ukraine has passed, at least as far as this offensive is concerned. Ukrainian and other European officials have pressed, of course, the US to loosen its restrictions even further, allowing Ukraine to strike anywhere inside Russia. We may not be at that point, but nonetheless evidence that things are inching forward. Sullivan's quote in full is that Ukraine is free to strike, quote, anywhere that Russian forces are coming across the border from the Russian side to the Ukrainian side to try and take additional Ukrainian territory. Russia has, in recent days, indicated it may soon move on the northeastern city of Sumy, something we've talked about before now, also near the Russian border, of course. If that happens, the policy would apply there as well, Sullivan said. Quote, "This is not about geography, it's about common sense. If Russia is attacking or about to attack from its territory into Ukraine, it only makes sense to allow Ukraine to hit back against the forces that are hitting it from across the border." So a step in the right direction for many, and indicative, if needed, that despite Russian rhetoric, such shifts have not sparked World War III. In fact, Putin has been left to go with his begging bowl to North Korea this week. It's frankly bonkers to see Russia as omnipotent in this context. But that doesn't stop Moscow making threats. Indeed, Putin said today that South Korea would be making a big mistake if it decided to supply arms to Ukraine, warning that the Kremlin would respond if it did so. That follows the news report yesterday suggesting South Korea would review the possibility of supplying weapons to Kyiv after Putin and Kim Jong-un signed that mutual defence pact. Just further evidence of how the war in Ukraine is having massive consequences that ripple all around the world. Now, in other news, another important step today as EU countries formally approve launching membership talks with Ukraine and Moldova next week, a landmark event for the two countries at the start of that long path towards joining the bloc. EU ministers will start negotiations first with Ukraine, they've said today, and then with Moldova. And that'll be in Luxembourg, as I say, on Tuesday. Joe Barnes will, of course, be following this very closely for us. I imagine we'll have him on the podcast next week. Talks also remain ongoing about Ukraine's path to NATO membership, of course, with a very revealing story indicative of the tensions between the broad European perspective on that question and indeed how far to back Kyiv in the war, and at the moment, the United States and Germany on those questions. Now, allegedly, as Tony Diver and Joe report for us, Washington and Berlin derailed a European plan to grant Ukraine an irreversible path to NATO membership. A group of European countries, including the UK, had hoped to describe Kyiv's path to join the alliance as irreversible. Crucial quote there, irreversible, in a communique to be signed off at the summit of the next month. They instead threw their weight behind offering Zelensky a lighter commitment to membership of the military alliance, with the US pushing for watered-down language, describing the process as a well-lit bridge to membership with no concrete timeline. And again, it's said that Berlin also supported that view. Referring to the US and German opposition to the enhanced offer, a source close to the discussion said, "Those two countries will be mighty relieved if we stay away from an open invitation. And anything short of that irreversibility, I think that's digestible for them." An interesting story, which of course will not be alien news to our listeners, but nonetheless is always worth flagging where we see those fault lines playing out on tangible agreements. Now, just on Germany, it is rumoured that certain countries failed to agree on the 14th package of sanctions on Russia within the EU, as Germany remained the key blocking force, despite the scrapping of a clause that Berlin found problematic. So the new measures include a ban on Russian LNG transshipments and a plan to make EU operators responsible for sanctions violations by subsidiaries and third parties, part of that ongoing struggle to try and contain the third country loopholes that we've described so often on the podcasts. Now, Germany's hesitation is due in part to an internal disagreement between its foreign ministry and the Chancellor Chancellor's office, diplomats who are close to the matter have said. And the removed clause was an expansion of the so-called No Russia clause to subsidiary companies in third countries. That was removed, as I say, and therefore there is suggestions that the 14th package will eventually go through, but without quite as strong as many people were pushing for with regards to there being no involvement, no engagement with Russia. So again, evidence that Germany is softer than other European countries on the issue of sanctions on Russia and cutting off all relations with them. Finally, just since we're talking about Germany here, I did just think I should mention the fact that it's been a very widely reported story that many people will have seen, which many are interpreting as quite indicative of tensions playing out in Germany at the moment with regard to Ukraine, which is that the musician Sir Rod Stewart gave a big concert in Germany last Friday where he openly defended his support for Ukraine. There was a Ukrainian flag on his screen behind him. He had an image of President Zelensky. And yet, at this gig in Leipzig, there were jeers as well as applause from fans as he talked about Ukraine. And for some people, as I say, this is suggestive of the fact that in Germany at the moment, it is not universally popular to be backing Ukraine in the way that other Western countries have. Now, I should say, this might just be something that's quite particular to Leipzig. It's a city I have been to, and there are lots of tensions that play out between the far right and activists who campaign against them, of the far left and other political movements. And just to give you a flavour of that, I remember I was last there in 2015 and was staying with some postgraduate students who were rather radical, shall we say. I remember entering the house, having to push the door open because there were so many stacks of beer bottles up against it. There was a sort of thick wall of smoke that dulled the light bulb dangling from a thread of wire on the ceiling, and there were, in the gloom just ahead, 3 dots of orange light which were lit cigarettes staring out from me from a table which was just littered with food stains, spilt drinks, ash piles. It was like a upended Jackson Pollock, and it was a really characterful house, but they had loads of posters up that were talking about the anti-far-right protests that were taking place and that they would go to. And I remember they had a baseball bat, which they kept by the front door, which had "Kein Nazis" written on, no Nazis. And they would take this with them as a means of, if they got into scuffles, which sounded pretty common, that they would have it there to defend themselves. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily commonplace in Leipzig. I imagine we've got some listeners in Leipzig who will be not too chuffed for me to be articulating and describing Leipzig in this way. But I think it is fair to say that there are certain German cities where the tensions between the left and the right play out more viscerally than in other cities. And of course, Ukraine is one of the fault line issues that we see that play out more, with, of course, both sides, far left and far right, being more sceptical with regards to Western support, German support for Ukraine. So whilst there might be a majority still that supports the war, you have people on the fringes in cities like Leipzig who do not, which might go some way to explaining the anger that was articulated by some people at that concert that drew such attention last week. So a little bit of context, but to stress, I liked Leipzig very much. Fascinating place and lovely people.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Francis. Let's move to our final thoughts then. Dom Nicholls, can I come to you first?
Yeah. Thanks, David. So the whole South Korea stuff, I'm very interested in, all the Korea, North and South, I'm looking at the moment. So let's just take a step back. You got the Quad, right? The Quadrilateral Defence, whatever, Pact Agreement thingy. Australia, India, Japan and the US. That's been set up for a few years. It's not seemed to have done an awful lot. It's a bit too geographically spread. You got from India right out in the west, the US, well, the US big player across the Pacific, but it doesn't seem to have done an awful lot. It doesn't really know what it's against. It's not overtly saying, China. So the Quad has done not an awful lot since it was set up. In recent months, there's been this idea of the Squad. Now, the S doesn't particularly stand for South Korea, but I'll come on to that in a moment. But the Squad is nothing formal yet, but this idea that Australia, the US, Japan and the Philippines and possibly South Korea might be a thing to a sort of Indo-Pacific defence. Well, alliance is far too strong, but grouping. But the difference being the Squad, which is South Korea is increasingly talked about as being involved in this move, is very hard-edged, and it is very clear that it is there to discuss the issue of a militarily aggressive China. I mean, the reason the Philippines have got involved here is all the tensions in the South China Sea. You would have seen the action by the Chinese Coast Guard against Philippine Coast Guard recently. So, the Squad might be an emerging loose defence grouping, okay, which includes South Korea. And if anything's going to push South Korea closer to taking a much more hard-edged defence view here in the region, particularly with some historic tensions with the likes of Japan, for example, it's going to be stuff like Putin going to North Korea and signing a defence pact. So just in the last few days, there's been a bit more argy-bargy between North and South Korea. There have been warning shots fired by South Korea in the last couple of days against a border incursion by North Korean troops, said to be the third one this month. Earlier today, Kim Jong-un's sister, a very powerful figure in North Korea, she was issuing threats against the South after there's constant balloons flying backwards and forwards, propaganda leaflets going from south to north, and bags of rubbish, including feces, going from north to south. So a lot of sort of tit-for-tat stuff happening there, but Kim's sister issuing a threat. And then this morning, South Korea summoned the Russian ambassador to protest against this defence pact that North Korea has signed with Russia. So increasing tension there on the Korean Peninsula and in the Indo-Pacific more generally, set against the context of the Squad potentially taking over from the Quad. Quite a lot to unpack here. We will, I'm not trying to do it all in one mouthful. We'll be talking about this more and more. But I think it is very, very interesting what is happening, in particular with South Korea, and the second and third order effects, the unintended consequences, if you like, of Putin trotting off to North Korea because he's got to go, as Francis says, got to go cap in hand to go and get some more artillery shells. And so all these things are just firming up a position which might be against Russia, might be against China, doesn't really matter. If they are talking, Australia, Japan, US, Philippines, South Korea, Britain, all the rest of it, if they're talking and it's taking on a harder edge, this defence grouping, then as much as Putin waves his fist in the air like some sort of Elmer Fudd and goes on about, there's going to be action, don't you do it, all those wabbits, I'm going to come over there and box you on the nose. Like Putin, you are increasingly seen as isolated, a bit paranoid, and having to look to North Korea for your artillery, Iran for your drones, and China for your microprocessors. So, on the grand scale, forget what's happening on the battlefield. I mean, it's not looking good politically at the moment. Things are firming up. And I just echo Francis' point there. These comments from Jake Sullivan today are very, very, very interesting, or comments yesterday. Set against all of that, if they're now saying, no, there's no change in policy. We've always said that Ukraine can use US-donated weapons against the Russian, across the border into Russia. I mean, things are moving, and it ain't going brilliantly geostrategically for Putin, as much as he likes to roll around in the armoured mercs with Kim and what have you. So just keep an eye on the wider stuff. But what's happening on the Korean Peninsula in particular, I think, is fascinating, especially for the implications it has with Russia and the war in Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Francis, would you like the final words to finish this week?
Well, thanks, David. I think the Russian bots will be coming for us today. They'll be rather upset with us this week. And just a line on that, actually, whilst it occurs to me, for our listeners on YouTube will be familiar that because we put up the episode usually at the same time, it's quite often swamped by Russian bots. But last week, a few of the episodes, for reasons beyond our control, as we always say in the outro, the episodes went up a little bit more staggered, a little bit more at unusual times. And lo and behold, no bots. It's almost as if they're programmed or prepared to go at certain times, that there's somebody waiting to fire them off from some small dark room in the FSB. Of course, it's all just speculation, but people who've done some interesting research on this for us and show that they are coming from certain bot farms and everything else. So, as I say, it's proof, if needed, that quite often the comments that you read under articles about Ukraine, under videos about Ukraine, are deliberately sent and targeted based on when they expect things to drop. And we've seen that, and many of our colleagues have seen that too. So just worth mentioning there. But my main final thought today is about human suffering. And I just wanted to draw attention to yet further evidence of the clampdown that is taking place in Russia at the moment. A Russian military court has jailed a teacher for 20 years on high treason charges for sending money to Ukraine, with the defendant saying colleagues reported him to the authorities. His name is Daniil Chalke, 27 years old, and he'll spend 5 years in prison and 15 more in a strict regime penal colony, according to a news agency in the country. They've said that allegedly he made 2 bank transfers in cryptocurrency worth about £1,000, which is about $1,200, $1,300, to a Ukrainian fund called Come Back Alive, will be known to some listeners, and it collects money for the Ukrainian armed forces. But as I say, 20 years for high treason as a result of that. Just further evidence of the misery that Russia is perpetrating on its own citizens as well as on the Ukrainian people. But speaking of the Ukrainian people, we have an exclusive interview in the newspaper today for video and print, conducted by our very own Daniel Sheridan, with Mrs. Zelensky, Olena Zelenska, of course, about the ways in which the war has pushed her, Mr. Zelensky, and the whole country towards a psychological burnout. And she talks about coping mechanisms, the impact on family life, where she finds inspiration, as well as more about what the country is suffering at the moment. It's a very intimate and personal interview, probably the most intimate I've actually seen with her. And so if you're interested in that, we will have a link in the show notes to it, as well as doing next week a dubbed version of that interview so that you can hear it for yourselves. But for those who are keen to hear it now, read it now, it will be available to you, and the link will be in the show notes. And just very finally, Chalke Valley next week, of course, the festival we've talked about. Very much looking forward to meeting some listeners there. And the other is in Scarborough. So if you're in the north of England, then we'll have links in the show notes to describe how you can meet us at the Scarborough Festival up there too. Just thought I would mention those because we're very, very much looking forward to engaging with people up there at those events. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley. And of course, we'll have that link to Danny's interview with Olena Zelenska in today's show notes. So do go check out the video there. And Francis, you're being very kind, and your words alluding to the staggering of episodes and going up at unusual times. I throw my hands up. It's me usually that uploads them. So if they are going up at odd times, it's usually because I haven't been able to, or there's been some bug. Francis has been very diplomatic and very kind to me, but I can put my hands up on that one. Hopefully today's will go out on time. But thank you very much, Francis Dearnley. Thank you very much, Dom Nicholls. Last week, I spoke to Ukrainian writer and soldier Oleksandr Mykhed. We spoke about his experience in the war, how he uses literature and writing to deal with the horror of the fighting, and about his new book, The Language of War. Here's our conversation. Well, Oleksandr, thank you so much for your time. It's really great to meet you. Thank you for coming into our offices here at the Telegraph. Would you start just by introducing yourself and your life to our listeners?
Hi, thanks for inviting, thanks for having me. My name is Oleksandr Mykhed. I am 36 years old. I am a writer and a serviceman of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion, I was the writer, the art critic, art curator, the artistic director of the publishing house, which published mainly non-fiction about the visual culture and arts, and as well as I was the scientific researcher at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine for 10 years. Since the full-scale invasion, I've totally felt that all my identities are not so valuable except one, that I am the writer. And me and my wife, we've spent 4 years happily living in Hostomel, which is suburbs of Kiev. And the full-scale invasion changed everything for us just from the scratch, from the morning of 24th of February of 2022. which is the start of the full-scale invasion. And since that time, the life changed totally, and that's why I'm presenting myself as the writer and the serviceman.
You said that the identity of the writer had become the most important. Why that? Why not something else?
That was a childhood dream, becoming a writer, and I usually focus on that, but still there were other projects that you are supposed to do for living or supporting your family or something like that. But the frame of the war clears your focus. It gives you the clear understanding that you don't have time, you don't have life, you don't have to spend that on the stuff that you are either not interested in. But on the other hand, I've been in the armed forces since the first week of the full-scale invasion. And for sure, there is no space for any kind of artistic, experimental something, discourse, and any other postmodern, meta-ironic, any other term you put that. There is no space for that. You just have to take your training and do your service. And that was really important throughout the understanding that this is the time for action. This is not the time for thinking about curatorial concepts or something. You just have to take a rifle and guard an object, and that's it. But throughout these times and throughout these new experiences, I figure out that still at the core of my identity is my writing, and through the writing I can fix all the emotions and all the experiences that happen to myself, to my family, and to my beloved ones and wider. Because I started writing taking the notes that later would become a non-fiction book called The Language of War. I started doing that just in the morning of 24th of February, and because I realized that this is the historical crack, this is the repetition of the World War II, and I realized that this is probably the most important events in my life that just occurred in front of my house. And I have to take notes because this is an experience that nobody should experience, but this is an experience that is valuable in fiction in terms of words.
When you started taking these notes, what are you writing down? Are you writing long notes, short notes? How did you find the time to do it? And how did you decide what you would record and what you wouldn't?
This is just a stream. This is just a stream of emotions and feelings. And for sure, as a writer, I know that I have to fix all 5, and if it's possible, all 6 senses. What do I think? What do I touch? How does the air smell? And I really strikingly remember how the air started smelling with the powder, because Russian helicopters were bombing Hostomel airport in 8 kilometers from our townhouse. Or the sounds. So that was about just fixing all kind of feelings that I have with the short sentences, because I did that with the pen in my notebook, because I thought that I have to spare the electricity, the energy, my battery on the cell phone, and I'd better use the older instruments. And from the beginning I realized that this is the beginning of the language of war, because I have to use all the tools that are hands to share the message, or at least this was for myself. But on the other situations, people would write on the bodies of their kids or something like that, because that was the most important, delivering the message, like writing the name of a kid and somebody's cell phone, either the granny or father or mother, if the kid would be lost in any kind of situation.
Did recording what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, get maybe easier is the wrong word, but did you get more used to it? Did it become a reflex to record what you're seeing around you and write it down? And were there any moments where you decided not to, where you wanted something just to happen and be somewhere else and not to be recorded?
I worked on The Language of War for 13 months. And this is the chronicle of the first year of invasion, plus 1 month for making interviews. And we have, me and my friend, a professional lawyer, we've made a chronicle of the war crimes committed by Russian servicemen on the Ukrainian territories and on occupied territories. And that was the time to rearrange everything. And I believed that, I write about this in the epilogue, I believed that if I'll finish the book, I could move on from the 24th of February as the turning point of my life. And I truly believed for that, like for 2 or 3 weeks. And then Russians started another acts of genocide, killing Victoria Melina, our fellow writer, in Kramatorsk, bombing the civilian pizza place. And the other example was Kakhovka Dam, when they exploded it, bombed it, and making a huge flood, and another example of their genocidal violence. And that were the moments when I started writing again. And I realized actually that this is my way of coping with chaos. This is my way of coping with trauma. This is my way of making some sense out of it. Because when you see the act of genocide, you see the void. You see something so huge that is beyond your imagination. But when you try to make a structure out of it, you have to find a word, then you make a sentence, then you make a paragraph, then you try to make a clear structure for your reader. And when you spend some time with this, you try to explain this to yourself. And that happened. For example, there is a chapter in The Language of War called Green City. This is the chronicle what I felt and what we've discovered during the Bucha massacre in the early April of 2022. And that is the darkest and the lowest point of my feelings during the full-scale invasion, as well as in the book. But that was really important to grab the moment and encapsulate the feelings that were at that time.
Do you think then, in a way, for you, writing is a way of taking back some control over things? As you said, you're imposing order and you're putting a framework on what's happening rather than the other way around?
Yeah, for sure. But it starts with the failure that I understand that this is the puzzle that could not be grabbed together. Like, you could not put all the pieces together, because the level of violence and the level of how many acts of the war crimes they committed on our territories, like, you could not count them, you could not describe them. So this is just the failure, the beautiful failure, because you have to realize that, you have to accept that, and then to work with the examples that might give you just a small hint of what's actually happening. And I wanted to make a book that tells the story on different layers. I've mentioned that what happens to me, to my family, because my parents spent almost 3 weeks in the occupied Bucha, and there I tell their story, how they've been saved, and this is almost evangelical one, how it happened. I tell the story of my friends, because some of my friends have been killed in action as a serviceman by Russians, and there is a requiem for my great friend Viktor Onisko, a brave officer. And when I tell the story of my family and my generation, there is as well a really important stuff that I think we have to remind each time, that now when we have a full-scale invasion, we can actually explain what has happened in Donetsk and Luhansk region in 2014. Because in that time, Russian propaganda tried to blur the truth, and they tried to make it dubious. It's not so obvious who annexed Crimea. It's not so obvious who actually voted in Luhansk and Donetsk region. And this is the time that we can actually explain that how it works, that how it was, and that's what they've been doing in Georgia in 2008. This is the stuff that they've been doing in Syria in mid-2010, etc. So this is the structure, telling my story, telling the story of my generation, and then trying to explain what they've been doing throughout decades.
You mentioned earlier Victoria Melina, the writer who was killed last year in Kramatorsk in the missile strike on the pizzeria. She was here in the studio I think it was last April.
Yeah, that was London Book Fair.
London Book Fair. She came in. We interviewed her twice, once remotely and once in person. Maybe more than a year ago. Well, since then, we've gone back and done lots of work looking at artists and writers and people of culture murdered in the war. And the idea that came back a lot was the historical parallels with the executed Renaissance in the 1930s. What do you think of that? Do you think those parallels are fair? And do you see yourself in the same ranks of those writers in the 30s who were killed? Do you think that's happening again today?
I think that we have the same enemy, we are in the same situation, and this is just the continuity of the clash that happened throughout centuries. Russia tried to abolish the Ukrainian language since like 19th century. They slaughtered the Ukrainian defenders throughout centuries. And I've never felt such deep connection to the history of Ukrainian literature and culture when I was standing on the funeral ceremonies of executed artists. And you have the direct feeling of and direct understanding. Usually at school, we would say in my childhood years, we were so annoyed by classical Ukrainian writers and classical Ukrainian literature. It's always about martyrdom. It's always about something bad happening, and they suffer a lot, and they try to do something. Usually they fail, and you could not stand that. That was not my childhood reality. Yeah, it was hard in 90s, but it was not so much as it was like the writings from 19th century or early 20th century. But with the moment of the full-scale invasion, you realize that there was no other reality than this. And they tried their best, but they just stayed with their people and they stayed with that history. And now there is a huge interest into Ukrainian classical literature in Ukraine, because we've and my fellows and my generation, they've discovered that actually what is their identity. They actually discovered that these past voices they're talking about right now, it is actually happening right now the same, and they could have some answers out of it. And usually when we talk about the Ukrainian writers, we usually talk about they don't live long from the history. It's like 30, 40 years old. Usually we would talk like the first collection of poetry, second collection of short stories. Probably he would be a great novelist, but we will never know because he was executed in Gulag system during Soviet era.
Which story or which part of your book are you most proud of writing, that you want people to read and want people to be aware of and know about?
This is a really interesting word that you've used, proud of, because this is the situation that this is really hard for me to talk about this book, because this book and this reality would not supposed to be happen in any given timeline that could be possible. And this is like my most important book, but this is the book that should never happen. So this is really hard to use the term proud, but I think that this is important for a reader to read it chapter by chapter, because we start with some easy stuff, which is like a conventional essay you'd expect from a Ukrainian writer to publish on the Western media, and then we deep dive into nonfiction that really broadens the borders of what nonfiction might be, and to the end, there is a huge chapter of how full-scale invasion influenced on Ukrainian kids and childhood. And I make parallels with the Holocaust and what are the games that Jewish kids would play in the concentration camps, for example. And I make parallels to the games that now Ukrainian kids are playing. And I think this is a really important chapter, as well as in the focus of this chapter. In the core of this chapter, there is a story of Anya Mishchenko, who was 14 years old, and she and her mother and one woman volunteer and one old lady, so there were 4 of them. They've been executed on March 5th of 2022 in Bucha by Russian servicemen. And your story, I think, is really important, because this is a story of a young girl, a teenager, who wanted to become a professional painter, a professional artist. And this should not happen, that a writer, an art historian, is working with the legacy of a 14-year-old artist. And I've been at her studio, just balcony. I've spoke to her brother and going through her archive and what she she has done. And this is again the story of a dream that would never be realized. And through this time I worked on this text for 6 months, grabbing the stories and collecting stories of kids, parents, and investigating into Anya's story. And this is like how it works. We started this somewhere in summer, talking about her, but in the late December there was a New York Times article where we actually found that they found out, due to the footage from CCTV, they found out the moment when they've been killed, how they've been killed, etc. So this is an example of the reality that should be talked, should be screamed, and should be put on paper.
What do you think that you've learnt by writing this book about yourself or about the war?
Usually I put 3 words when somebody is asking me for inscribing the book for them. I put 3 words: rage, love, and memory. And I consider this book as an instrument for ourselves, and probably now for British audience, for keep our rage sharp. Because I don't use word hate, because hate is destructible and the rage gives you fuel. The rage is constructive. You can use this either for donations or support or being in the armed forces, or just wake up in the morning because you are raged. Memory is for we should not forgive and we should not forget. And the purpose of this book and the purpose of my generation and those who are fighting right now is to still keep on going, no matter how long it will last. And we should speak about this, and we should keep on fighting and memorizing those who've been killed by Russians. And the love stands for the idea that the war gives you people, because the whole reality is so mixed up in a really bad way, but you find brilliant people that you would never met in your normality before the evil comes to your threshold. So this is again about those who support you. There is a line in the book that when you lost the house, because it was hit by our house was hit by the missile strike during the first week of the invasion. So there is a line in the text about it, that the moment you lose your house, you realize that the whole country is your home. And this really stands for love.
You mentioned just that the amazing people that you've met, that you meet, even that you would never have met in another situation. Could you tell us about some of the amazing people you've met?
There are 2 characters in the book that I mentioned that I really love. These are 2 brothers in arms that I've met in the barracks in Chernivtsi in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. One is call sign Bulachka, or Muffin. He is 26 years old, and he is a really fantastic pizzaiolo who has a great bakery and multi-talented everything making with his hands, and his food is so delicious and he's so funny, and women love him, just love him.
Why?
Because he is so funny, he is so nice, and usually we would go in all the tasks making together, and he speaks like Italian, Polish, all kind of that, and he is in the martial arts and everything. And these are the experiences when this is not the family and this is not a friend. This is something goes beyond, because you understand that no matter what, he'll be there for you. The other one is the guy, there is a chapter called Call Sign for Job, and I tell his story. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, he was 44 years old. He is from Melitopol, and he is the professor who is ichthyologist, so he research on fish, and he is one of the biggest specialists on that specific area. So he and his wife lost the house, they've lost the business, because Melitopol was occupied just a few days into full-scale invasion. And he evacuated in Chernivtsi, and he became just a soldier. Professor becoming a soldier driver who starts from the lowest position in the armed forces. And in the early stage of the war, we've stayed in the dormitory. So that was the tricky situation when a professor starts his new life in the dormitory again at 44. And the moment I've lost my house, he told me, we are young. We will rebuild everything. And he really supported me in that. And after the book came out in Ukraine in June last year, in August, they've been in Bakhmut. And during his first morning when he became a sergeant, and in the first morning he commanded his people for a position, they've spent there like 30 minutes, and then the Russian tank hit on their position, and the particles of the bomb, they hit his body, and 4 particles they could not grab from his body. So he was slowly dying, and his amazing wife, who is again a professor and ichthyologist, she appeared in the hospital and she saved him. And later he survived, he is okay right now, and he is, due to all the injuries and everything he's lost, he is now back to civilian life, and he's trying to restart again after everything. But this is a typical Ukrainian story right now. You have everything, and then in the next moment you have nothing except your knowledge. And this chapter, Call Sign for Job, it ends with the call sign that this friend, my brother in arms, picked up for his service, and the nickname for the army is Lucky. And he says, I'm truly believes that probably it might help me in the war. So he was lucky enough to survive after the tank bombed their position.
What do your comrades in arms think about your writing? Do you talk about it much with them? How does that conversation go?
They are truly support, and we had several online presentations or something like streams, and usually they would watch it, and we had a special moment when I have a special chapter during the stream that I said, and now there is a special word of the day for my brothers in arms, and then we have some crazy special unique term that they should argue between themselves, like trying to puzzle what does it mean and everything. So this was like it was, and it's still something that is like a dialogue that continues, and we are in the line, and so total support from them.
You mentioned obviously your book came out in Ukraine first. How has it been different talking to Ukrainians about what you've done and them reading it? And I imagine almost everybody will understand personally, viscerally what you mean, but then coming abroad and speaking to British people about what you're writing about who don't have that first-hand knowledge of what you're talking about. How have you navigated that?
Yeah, I had the feeling that during the full-scale invasion, I have nothing to tell to Ukrainian audience because everybody understands everything, like you should not explain. But then gradually, like 6-10 months into invasion, I realized from the feedback from the texts that were published in English or in German, like in Financial Times, in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, in The Guardian, and Ukrainian readers, Ukrainian audience read them, and they said it helps, it gives us something. And I realized that probably I should not be so focused only talking to the foreign audience. And the book, probably it's 95% of something that we would usually discuss the same here at home, because here I just need to give more context or explain something like who are cyborgs or defenders of Donetsk airport, Ukrainian heroes from 2014 or something like that. And probably I should not be so tolerant and trying to be normal during the talks and interviews with the Western readers, because at home you could just feel a bit more relaxed on that, because we understand that all of us are dead tired, and usually you don't choose the words when you are dead tired. So but the book is written in a way that it should be read in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years, because this is not the collection of news that get old. This is the book that should go to the archetype level of what might happen during the invasion in any given country where Russia would enter. And that's the point.
Did you find yourself writing about anything you didn't expect? Did anything surprise you about writing this book and about the stories you were telling?
This is just probably about decisions that you should make, because, for example, I've mentioned this chronicle of the war crimes, and in the book there is like 30%, 35% of what we've gathered. Because the moment I've started editing it, I've realized that I'm not able even to read through this. And I had to make choices just for making it understandable to my readers, because nobody would go through the first chapter of the war crimes and then they just said, I don't need to read this book. So as a writer, I should find the balance between giving the presentation of the war crimes and still keep the focus of the reader to keep on reading and still to create, I don't know, a safe space is not the proper word, but just a trust to the narrator that I'll keep on thinking about you, that I will hold your hand and I will walk you through these horrors.
How do you find that balance in your writing?
If a reader would go through the book and through all the chronicles, so that I found the balance. Because it is about giving a tiny detailed story. It's like a paragraph. Something happened at that date in Kiev, slaughtery. Next day, something happened in terms of rape. And next day, something happened in the terms of missile strike. And that these are different fragments of different war crimes on different levels. And then they raped a baby. And then they killed an old lady. And that's what's happening. You just have to put... Again, we get back to the metaphor of puzzle. You could not hold these sharp puzzle parts, but you have to make at least some kind of picture to give the idea of what's happening.
Could you tell us what the next few weeks looks like for you? Are you going back into the army? When you get back to Ukraine, what do the next few months look like in your life?
This is really interesting and tricky, because I leave with the feeling that I don't have a future. I live with the feeling that I don't have any plans. For example, for Ukrainian coming into UK, you have to apply and to get your visa in Warsaw, and they would stuck a visa in your passport in the morning of your flight. So I didn't know that I would come here until I get the visa in the morning and I had my plane in 10 hours. So that's the way of how it works. So I will get back to the armed forces. I'm not on the front line yet. My service is a bit different than front line, but still you are at the service and you are the part of the system. And yeah.
I've spoken to people in Bucha about being called up for the front, people in their 50s who they admit they're not necessarily the perfect soldiers, but they say, if I'm called, I will go, I think was what Ihor told me. How do you think about that, if that happens? If you're told, we're bringing you forward, essentially, how do you think about that, or do you think about it at all?
I'm not allowed to talk about this stuff.
For people not from Ukraine, for a foreign audience who don't live in a country at full-scale war, what are the most important lessons you would want them to take from what you've written?
We should stay together. This is the war of the normality against chaos. This is a war of future against the past. They don't have future. Russians, they don't have the vision of how to deal with the future. They live their past heroic lives and they try to bring these ideas into life, but these are like zombie ideas, and this is not about normality. So the main that I really like the comment under the Guardian article about the book, and there was the line stating, I won't read this book because of empathy, I will read this book because of my fear. And I think this is the best command, because we have something to share. This is, for my fellow writers, we saw that at a certain moment the foreign audience is listening to Ukrainians not because of the empathy, but because they start realizing that there are probably some lessons that we could learn out of their experience. Because if at a certain moment this might become a front line for not only for Ukrainians and Russian ambitions and the chaotic ideas that they have, they might spread all over. And this is that we are really open to sharing our experience. And if this book gives just a tiny hint that under all the numbers of statistics, there are people, and if it gives the idea that we are losing representatives like from each area, and that this war is really clear what is good and what is bad, so my task is successful.
Oleksandr, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important to mention, or you'd want our listeners to know?
I'm really grateful for all support that we have, and I'm really grateful that the world is still with us, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for your time, Oleksandr. Coming up, we hear Dom and Francis's final thoughts. Well, thank you very much, Dom. Francis, would you like the final words to finish this week?
Well, thanks, David. I think the Russian bots will be coming for us today. They'll be rather upset with us this week. And just a line on that, actually, whilst it occurs to me, for our listeners on YouTube will be familiar that because we put up the episode usually at the same time, it's quite often swamped by Russian bots. But last week, a few of the episodes, for reasons beyond our control, as we always say in the outro, the episodes went up a little bit more staggered, a little bit more at unusual times. And lo and behold, no bots. It's almost as if they're programmed or prepared to go at certain times, that there's somebody waiting to fire them off from some small dark room in the FSB. Of course, it's all just speculation, but people who've done some interesting research on this for us and show that they are coming from certain bot farms and everything else. So, as I say, just it's proof, if needed, that quite often the comments that you read under articles about Ukraine, under videos about Ukraine, are deliberately sent and targeted based on when they expect things to drop. And we've seen that, and many of our colleagues have seen that too. So just worth mentioning there. But my main final thought today is about human suffering. And I just wanted to draw attention to yet further evidence of the clampdown that is taking place in Russia at the moment. A Russian military court has jailed a teacher for 20 years on high treason charges for sending money to Ukraine, with the defendant saying colleagues reported him to the authorities. His name is Daniil Kliuka, 27 years old, and he'll spend 5 years in prison and 15 more in a strict regime penal colony, according to a news agency in the country. They've said that allegedly he made 2 bank transfers in cryptocurrency worth about £1,000, which is about $1,200, $1,300, to a Ukrainian fund called Come Back Alive, will be known to some listeners, and it collects money for the Ukrainian armed forces. But as I say, 20 years for high treason as a result of that. Just further evidence of the misery that Russia is perpetrating on its own citizens as well as on the Ukrainian people. But speaking of the Ukrainian people, we have an exclusive interview in the newspaper today for video and print, conducted by our very own Daniel Sheridan, with Mrs. Zelensky, Olena Zelenska, of course, about the ways in which the war has pushed her, Mr. Zelensky, and the whole country towards a psychological burnout. And she talks about coping mechanisms, the impact on family life, where she finds inspiration, as well as more about what the country is suffering at the moment. It's a very intimate and personal interview, probably the most intimate I've actually seen with her. And so if you're interested in that, we will have a link in the show notes to it, as well as doing next week a dubbed version of that interview so that you can hear it for yourselves. But for those who are keen to hear it now, read it now, it will be available to you, and the link will be in the show notes. And just very finally, Chalke Valley next week. Of course, the festival we've talked about, very much looking forward to meeting some listeners there. And the other is in Scarborough. So if you're in the north of England, then we'll have links in the show notes to describe how you can meet us at the Scarborough Festival up there too. Just thought I would mention those because we're very, very much looking forward to engaging with people up there at those events. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley. And of course, we'll have that link to Danny's interview with Olena Zelenska in today's show notes, so do go check out the video there. And Francis, you're being very kind, and your words alluding to the staggering of episodes and going up at unusual times. I throw my hands up. It's me usually that uploads them. So if they are going up at odd times, it's usually because I haven't been able to, or there's been some bug. Francis has been very diplomatic and very kind to me, but I can put my hands up on that one. Hopefully today's will go out on time. But thank you very much, Francis Dearnley. Thank you very much, Dom Nicholls. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.